Hello, true crimerers of YouTube. I think I'm actually required to tell you now. So TikTok has called me a violent extremist for defending the victims of Jeffrey Dahmer, for standing up for serial killer victims. I'm now a terrorist and a very violent person, and I'm trying to promote that. So I think I'm required to go door to door and tell you guys. I don't know. So here I am, just being transparent. I'm sorry. That app is such a joke. Anyway, here's another compilation video, because now I really got to get these videos over here quickly, because that page is about to go away foreversville. They're just really itching to get rid of me for the third time. So anyway, this is a compilation video that is going to be full of closure, actually, finally. So these are all stories that I told over on TikTok that are solved cold cases. So I think there's a 20-something, a little over 20 stories here. So yeah, without further ado, from your local violent extremist to the next, here are a bunch more cases from TikTok. The viewer discretion is apparently strongly advised now with me, so. Right here in this Google Maps image, a 20-year mystery was solved. Can you see it? Hello, true crimerers. This is the case of William Moldt. Viewer discretion is advised. 40-year-old William lived in Latana, Florida. On November 8th, 1997, William would vanish. That night, William had gone to a nightclub and was spotted by numerous people, and he did not appear to be intoxicated. He would then call his girlfriend sometime around 9:30 p.m. He would tell her, "I'm on my way home." And then again to her, he did not sound like he was drunk. William never got home. He was quickly reported missing, and then an investigation began, but literally nothing came of it. They had absolutely nothing. They had no reason to believe that he would just run off on his own. They had no reason to believe there was foul play. He didn't have any enemies. William just vanished off the face of the earth like that. That is until 2019, when the mystery was solved. A man was looking through Google Earth maps, and when he zoomed in on a certain area, something caught his eye. Well, he zoomed in some more. Do you see it yet? Can you see what I see? Here, let's circle it for you. Do you see it now? Yep. That appears to be a car submerged in the water. The man, who apparently pays attention to the smallest detail, and thank God he did, he called police right away and said, "Listen, I think there's a car submerged in the lake." And when they got there, they were able to spot it like this. And sure enough, they pulled this vehicle out. And inside the vehicle was the skeletal remains of one person. Through dental records, they were able to confirm that it was 40-year-old William Moldt. His cause of death at that point, since he was submerged underwater for so long, was impossible to know. But there were no, physical wounds, no stab wounds, no gunshot wounds, at least nothing on his, bones. He was not a heavy drinker. He did have some drinks the night he went missing, but he was not someone who really ever got drunk. At the time, in 1997, this neighborhood wasn't really there. It was primarily an empty lot. So it's very likely that no one would have seen this happen. They determined that the Google Maps image, this one, was actually taken in 2007. But no one was able to spot that little tiny detail right there until 2019. Police have no choice but to believe that he just lost control of his car somehow and just went into the lake and was unable to free himself. Sadly, these things happen. But if foul play was involved, that will probably never be able to be determined, unless someone would come forward, but this was very likely just an accident. A young boy in California would go missing, and it would take 18 years to find out the truth. Hello, true crimerers. This is the case of Curtis Huntzinger. Viewer discretion is advised. At the time of this story, Curtis is a 14-year-old boy living in Blue Lake, California, and he has a humongous family, a whole bunch of brothers and sisters. Well, in May of 1990, Curtis would come forward to his mother and tell a very disturbing story. His claim was that a family friend of theirs, Stephen Hash, was sexually assaulting him. Now, Curtis's mother, Nancy, was obviously distraught over this information and went to the police. And the police would take Curtis on a ride just to kind of get some information out of him to see what was going on. And Curtis, probably feeling very intimidated, very nervous, he denied all of the sexual assault allegations that he had told his mother. And then a couple of weeks later, Curtis, on May 18th, 1990, would vanish. And he was reported missing the next day. Police considered Curtis to be a runaway. After all, he was, at times, a troubled youth. He had gotten in trouble with the law a couple of times. And possibly he was embarrassed over this whole scenario with Stephen Hash that, he just ran away. But the family and Nancy did not believe he ran away. She knew something was wrong. Foul play was involved. They would protest in front of the police department saying, you need to look into this. 3 years would go by, nothing. 6 more years later, they get a jailhouse confession. A prisoner who had actually killed an 11-year-old child named Thomas Michael Fox, he said he shot and killed Curtis Huntzinger, and that he and Stephen Hash buried the boy. Police would search the area where they claimed they buried him, but they never found anything. And then also in 1999, allegedly, Stephen Hash, in a fit of anger, confessed he killed the boy to Nancy. He said, I buried him in the woods, and again, she reported this to the police, and he denied it. And again, they never found his body. Stephen's ex-wife went to police and said, he confessed to me that he murdered Curtis. But again, they had no physical evidence, they had no body, they had nothing. In 2008, new detectives would look into this case again. They spoke to Stephen Hash's ex-wife, and she again told them that he very vividly confessed to the murder. And finally, police were able to get a warrant to arrest Stephen Hash. And then I guess the guilt was weighing on him too much because he finally confessed. He said he was sexually assaulting Curtis. When Curtis went to tell his mom, well, he had to silence Curtis. Stephen would lead him to the location of the body. It took them a while to find it, but they did. Roots had grown through his body. Stephen only got 11 years for voluntary manslaughter. Hello, true crimerers. It is time for another Christmas murder story. And this is the case of Jack and Elaine Denney. Viewer discretion is advised. Jack and Elaine were high school sweethearts, and they both graduated high school in 1960, and by the end of 1961, they were married. By 1981, they would move to Locust Grove, Oklahoma, and then they had 2 children together, Chris and Sarah. They had grandchildren, and they were just madly in love with each other. By 2007, Jack had retired from his mechanical maintenance career, and him and Elaine could enjoy the rest of their lives together. But sadly, Jack and Elaine are on my page, so unfortunately it would not be much longer. On Christmas Day 2007, their daughter Sarah would enter the home and find them both shot to death. Jack was 65 years old and Elaine was 66. There was no murder weapon left behind, but there were several 9mm casings all over the place. The baffling part to investigators and to the family is Jack and Elaine didn't have any enemies. They're this completely sweet, unassuming couple, just living out their lives, not harming anyone. So who would do this and why? There was evidence that money was taken out of Jack's wallet because it was empty, but police didn't really have anything else. There was no foreign DNA left behind, there were no fingerprints left behind. Was this just a random robbery? Was this a case of mistaken identity? God bless America. Ugh. An inmate serving time at an Oklahoma jail by the name of Justin Walker, he would come forward to say, hey, I was hired to kill the couple because we wanted to rob the house of guns. Right. An arsenal of guns in their home. Okay, Justin. But at the time, police didn't really have anything to physically connect him to the crime. He would then recant his statement. He even would go on to say he doesn't even remember giving the statement. Ay, ay, ay. By 2018, they get more tips about Justin Walker, minus the Hagrid beard. He was indicted by a grand jury. He, of course, pleaded not guilty, but he would go to trial. Now, the evidence was purely circumstantial, but it was enough, and the jury convicted him. And so Walker was sentenced to 40 years in prison. He will be 76 years old when he is released. I sure wish they got to see 76 years. He gave no motive, but it was likely for $100 that was in Jack's wallet. $100. Hello, truest of all of the crimerers. Don't ever do that again, okay. This is the case of Michelle Martinko. Viewer discretion is advised. Michelle was born on October 6th, 1961 in Cedar Rapids, Iowa. She attended Cedar Rapids High School. She got good grades. She didn't really cause any problems. She was a good kid. On the night of December 19th, 1979, she would attend a choir concert that was being held at a nearby Sheraton Inn. She drove the family's 1972 Buick Electra. She was wearing this exact black dress, and she had a good time at the event. After the event was over, she went to the Westdale Mall because she wanted to do some shopping. She was actually looking for a new fur coat. And planning for this, she had about $180 on her person. She was last seen in the mall outside of a jewelry store sometime around 9 p.m. And after she never got home, her parents obviously grew concerned, so they called police. This is well before cell phones and technology, really, so that was really the only thing they could do. Sadly, at 4 a.m., now on December 20th, 1979, parked outside the JCPenney of the Westdale Mall, they found the family's Buick, and inside was the body of Michelle Martinko. She was slumped over into the passenger seat, and she was stabbed to death. She had 29 stab wounds. It was clear she tried to fight back because she had defensive wounds on her hands. They did find blood essentially all over the car inside, so they determined that the murder took place directly in the car. There were no fingerprints in the car that didn't belong to the family. Most of the blood belonged to Michelle. But on the gear shift, they found blood scrapings that didn't match Michelle's DNA type. There was also blood on the outside of the car, but it belonged to Michelle. Police had very few leads to go with. They interviewed as many males that came into Michelle's life as possible, including her ex-boyfriend Andy, who was at the mall that night, but they said she was killed sometime around 9 p.m., which would have been just shortly after she left, and at that point, Andy had an airtight alibi. The case goes cold for decades. In 2018, they take those little blood scrapings from the gear shift, and they use that genotyping fancy shit, and they create this profile. And eventually that brings them to a man by the name of Jerry Lynn Burns. Pretty similar. So they arrest him and confirm that it is his DNA. Fun fact, in his interrogation, he brought up the missing Jody Huisentruit. Anyway, he got life without parole. Hello, true crimerers. This is the case known as the Big Ben's murder. Viewer discretion is advised. So, Big Ben's is a 24-hour convenience store, and that's located on Cape Breton Island in Nova Scotia, Canada. This was 46-year-old Lorraine Marie Dupe. And in March of 1992, she was a new employee at Big Ben's convenience store. During this time in Nova Scotia, there was a really big snowstorm, and it made driving conditions really bad, kind of unsafe. Lorraine's husband tried to convince her to not go to work that night because it's just not safe to drive. But in her mind, she's thinking, I'm a new hire at this place. I don't want to call off, especially because on March 22nd, 1992, it was her very first night shift. So she decided to go to work. Just 4 hours into her shift, a customer walked in and saw her lying in a pool of blood. She was still alive. She was desperately gasping for air. But she had been stabbed 40 times, and she would not pull through. She died that night. Now, because of the weather, there was snow everywhere. There was no actual footprints. they honestly had no clues to work with. The only thing they had was one cigarette butt found near her body. So police collected it and they did obtain a DNA profile from it. But at the time, they didn't really have the capability of matching it to anyone. But then, in 2001, they ran the DNA again. This time, they got a match. It belonged to a man called Ernest Gordon Strobridge. He would have been 17 years old in 1992. Now, as I've discussed in previous videos, Canada uses the Mr. Big operation. And so they utilize that, in this case, to try to get him to confess. So through an elaborate Mr. Big operation, where police officers pose as a criminal organization, Ernest willingly confessed to the murder of Lorraine Marie Dupe. In 2003, he went on trial for the murder, and he was found guilty and he was convicted. Because he was 17 years old at the time of the crime, he had to be given the option of parole. So he got a life sentence, but his first parole would have been after just 7 years. But that'll never have to happen, because in 2013, at the age of 37, he died in prison of what they say is natural causes. And Lorraine got her justice. Hello, true crimerers. This is the case known as the Signal Mountain Murders. Viewer discretion is advised. Also, this back support I got yesterday from one of y'all is amazing. On July 9th, 1988, near Chattanooga, Tennessee, at the Signal Mountain Trails, these three chums would go ATV riding. They were 22-year-old Kenneth Griffith, 23-year-old Earl Smock, and Earl's 49-year-old father-in-law, Richard Mason. Now, they would leave the Mason home around 6 p.m. on their ATVs. And this was something they commonly did. They even did it when it got dark outside. But they always returned home that night. But this time, they didn't. The following morning, the families grew concerned. So they began to search for the three men. A few hours into the search, a man who was not involved with the search had a flat tire on his car on Roberts Camp Road. He had peered into a nearby trash dump that I guess was near a bluff over there, and he noticed the three ATVs. These ones. They were covered in blood. After this discovery and the police were there, a resident in the nearby area would come forward to say the night before, he heard gunshots. So the next morning, the investigators began to search that area where the gunshots were heard, and that was called the Gate. I guess is what the locals call that area. When they got there, they found ATV tire tracks. Then they noticed a fallen branch with blood on it. As they walked further, they saw drag marks, then a pool of blood, and then brain tissue and bone fragments. It was clear that somebody was killed here, but the bodies themselves were not there. It would be 2 days later at a dump site a couple miles away, the bodies of all three men were found. They had all been shot with a shotgun. Witnesses said they saw a pickup truck that night with three ATVs in the back, and two men were in the front of the vehicle. They came to the conclusion that the killer was someone local and someone who knew the back roads well. But sadly, it would go unsolved for almost 10 years. In April of 1997, this man, Frank Castile, was arrested for the murders. He was considered a suspect early on. That was because he owned property where the men were killed. They believe he stumbled on them when they were at Blue Hole, a little watering hole near his property. Frank Castile had apparently told them before, "Get off my property or I'll shoot." Apparently this time he did it. How he was never arrested, I have no idea. But he was convicted and he got life. And he died in 2019. There is perhaps no better feeling than when a cold case finally gets solved. Hello, true crimerers. This is the case of Bradley Perry. Viewer discretion is advised. On May 25th, 1984, 22-year-old Bradley Perry was working at the family's gas station in Perry, Utah. The family owned like a little Texaco gas station and convenience store, and his parents and the rest of his family were actually out of town that night. He decided to stay behind to earn some extra money. Sadly, that would be the last decision he would ever make. In the early morning hours now of May 26, 1984, sometime around 4 o'clock, a man fitting this description would walk into the gas station. Exactly what happened between point A and point B of this story is still kind of unknown, but this unidentified man would take Bradley to the back of the store, he would tie him up, and he would just beat the ever-living life out of him. He also stabbed him and strangled him. And then allegedly his head was crushed by a soda canister. Like, this is insane amount of overkill. Either right as this is happening or sometime very shortly afterwards, 2 college students would pull into the gas station, and before they could go into the convenience store portion, they were approached by a tall man, a man that basically that's where we got the description from, the composite drawing. He was described as a lean, dark-haired man. The man offered to pump their gas for them and to go inside the store and get the cigarettes they wanted to purchase, so they handed him a $5 bill for the cigarettes. And here's the really interesting parts. The man came back out with change. One of the dollar bills had a wet red stain on the corner. No, this is not the actual bill. This is just a stock photo, TikTok, calm down. And that's also when the college students noticed some red stains on the man's shoes. So they quickly took the change and sorted it all out, and then they left and went immediately to the police station. When they arrived, they found the body of Brad Perry in the back. Unfortunately, there wasn't much evidence to collect, but they did have some hair samples that were left behind near the body, and they collected that evidence and kept it. They also released the composite drawing, but they got no hits. It wouldn't be until about 20 years later when the DNA they were able to pull from the hair matched a man who was already in prison for a federal crime. That man was Glenn Howard Griffin. The family waited for more than 2 decades, and they finally got their man. He bore a striking resemblance to the composite drawing as well. There was also blood left behind that actually matched him. So he was charged with first-degree murder, and he was sentenced to life without parole. She would vanish from her California neighborhood on Thanksgiving, and her family wouldn't know the full story until 43 years later. Hello, true crimerers. This is the Thanksgiving case of Terri Lynn Hollis. Viewer discretion is advised. On November 23rd, 1972, Terri was 11 years old, and her family were living in South Torrance, California. A lot of kids get restless on Thanksgiving. They're just sort of bored sitting at home, and she just wanted to get outside. So she went out around 3 o'clock in the afternoon. She was just going to take her bike and go for a little ride around the neighborhood. She was nowhere to be found an hour later, 2 hours later, 3 hours later. Now it's starting to get dark, and Terri has not come home, and she is nowhere. At 8:55 p.m., her parents would report her missing to the police. And within just a few minutes of that phone call, there would be a huge search for the 11-year-old girl. The search would not last very long. At approximately 10:15 a.m. the following morning, about 70 miles away from where Terri Lynn lived, along the Ventura County shoreline, the body of a young girl was found. 2 fishermen would find her body about 20 feet below, and she was thrown on some rocks. She was positively identified as Terri Lynn Hollis. She only had on a white t-shirt, but everything else was off. The coroner would say that she was sexually assaulted, and then she was strangled to death. And then when the killer was done with her, he just threw her down a hill. As if this 11-year-old girl was garbage. Police began their murder investigation. Witnesses said they saw a man riding a bicycle alongside Terri Lynn around 4 p.m. that afternoon in the neighborhood. But then that lead would turn out to be not true. It wasn't Terri Lynn, and the man was actually a young boy. Police were able to figure out that she went to a park about 2 miles away from the house, and that is likely where she was abducted from. They investigated like crazy. They looked for sex offenders in the area. They even arrested and charged people with her murder, but then released them because there was no physical evidence connecting them. DNA was taken from Terri's body, but in 1972, they didn't have the technology to do anything with that. In 2015, using the genealogy analysis system, they came up with this profile, and they found relatives of the person who committed the murder. It would lead them to Jake Edward Brown, who looks as drunk as you possibly could in this photo. He was 36 at the time of the murder. He had spent time in prison for sexual assaults. However, by 2015, he was already dead. He never had to pay for her murder. Hello, true crimerers. This is the recently solved murder of Faith Hedgepeth. Viewer discretion is advised. Faith was born on September 26, 1992 in Warren County, North Carolina. She was actually a member of the Haliwa-Saponi Native American tribe. Now, in 2012, she was a student at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. At about 5:45 p.m. on September 6, 2012, Faith was attending a little party. It was an event for the Alpha Pi Omega, which was a Native American sorority that she wanted to join. She left around 7:15 p.m. and she went to the university's library with her roommate, whose name is Karina Rosario. The two of them left the library around 11:30 p.m. and went back to their apartment. And they lived together at an off-campus apartment complex. Roughly 30 minutes after that, they went to a little nightclub called The Thrill. They got there around 12:40 in the morning. The two of them would dance the night away until CCTV footage saw them both leaving at 2:06 a.m. And the two of them got back to the apartment around 3 o'clock in the morning. At 4:25 in the morning, Karina Rosario would then leave the apartment again when she went to go hang out with a friend named Jordan McCrary. Karina said that when she left the apartment, Faith was in her room and she actually left the apartment door unlocked. At 10:30 in the morning the next day, Karina was trying to get a hold of Faith, but Faith wasn't answering texts or phone calls. Shortly after 11 a.m., after Karina arranged a ride with a friend, they walked into the apartment and then into her bedroom, and then they found the partially nude body of Faith Hedgepeth wrapped in a bloody quilt, and next to her body, written on a fast food bag, was a note that says, "I'm not stupid, bitch, jealous." 911 was obviously called right away. The autopsy would show that she was killed by blunt force trauma. They believe the murder weapon was a glass alcohol bottle. They also found bodily fluids on Faith, as well as throughout the apartment, which they took samples of. They of course suspected an ex-boyfriend of Faith's, but his DNA did not match that was left on Faith. It wasn't until September 16th, 2021, which at the time of this video was yesterday, the DNA got a match. It matched Miguel Enrique Salguero Olivares. He was officially arrested on September 16th and charged with first-degree murder. Unfortunately, that's basically all we kind of know. The authorities have not released yet whether or not he knew Faith, or if this was just a random attack, but he was never a suspect initially. But justice is finally being served. Hello, true crimerers. This is the case of the KFC murders. Viewer discretion is advised. On September 23rd, 1983, in Kilgore, Texas, just minutes before the restaurant's closing time, there were a mix of employees and a couple of customers in the building. 20-year-old David Maxwell, 20-year-old Joey Johnson, 19-year-old Monty Landers, 37-year-old Mary Tyler, and 39-year-old Opie Hughes, when the doors opened and at least two men walked inside. The only for sure things that people know at this point is they had already counted down the money for the night, because they had called into the KFC headquarters to report the money. The headquarters claims they heard voices of possibly three men. And then the next thing anyone knows, none of the people who were supposed to come home that night from the restaurant got home. A lot of the victims were very young, and it was normal for them to, go out after work. So the loved ones weren't exactly rushed at that point to be like, oh my God, someone's missing. But Again, this is a true crime page, and we are devoid of happiness and joy here. Located in an oil field off Country Road 232, laying in this very field were 5 dead bodies. The blood on them was dry, but there was no decomposition, there was no major odor, so these 5 bodies were fresh. The bodies found here were later confirmed to be the 5 people who were at the KFC the night before. It was clear that those 5 people were abducted and then brought to this field. They were virtually lined up with their heads resting on their arm like this, and all of them had at least 1 bullet hole in the back of the head. So they were all shot execution style. One of the bodies was actually a lot farther down, and that body had evidence of sexual assault. And that was the body of Mary Tyler. They would find DNA on her body that didn't belong to any of the victims. They also found nail clippings, which they collected. They stole about $3,000. They did also find a little pool of spilled blood in the restaurant, and that didn't match any of the victims. When they ran it, it matched no one. This case went cold for 20 years, until 2005, when the spilled blood matched Darnell Hartsfield and Romeo Pinkerton, 2 men who were already in prison in 2005. So they both went on trial and they both got convicted. They both got 5 life sentences. And in a twist, they said there was a 3rd man that they won't reveal. Who is that? Hello, true crimerers. This is the case of Polly Klaas. Viewer discretion is advised. On the evening of October 1st, 1993, 12-year-old Polly was having a slumber party with a couple of friends at her Petaluma, California home. According to her 2 friends, around 10:30 p.m. that evening, an unknown man knocked on their bedroom door, and when Polly opened it, this man, holding a knife, would proceed to tie up Polly's 2 friends. He would tie the 2 friends up using some ripped cloth and cut up cords from a Nintendo. He then placed pillowcases over the 2 friends' heads, told them to count to 1,000, and then he left the house with Polly. The girls didn't count to 1,000, but waited until they heard him leave. They managed to then untie themselves and wake up Polly's mother, whose name is Eve. Eve and Polly's father, Mark, they were divorced at this point, and Mark lived about 30 minutes away. Polly's mother calls 911 immediately, and the search would begin. Now, at first, they did suspect Polly's father, Mark, but after some thorough investigation, they were able to clear him of having any involvement in this. He just wanted his daughter to be found. Several hours later, and about 20 miles away from the Klaas home, a babysitter would report seeing a car stuck in a ditch. So she called local deputies, they came out, and the man with the vehicle was named Richard Allen Davis. They searched his car, they ran his plates, there was nothing abnormal about him, no warrants, nothing like that. They called a tow truck driver, they got his car out of the ditch, and that was the end of it. They did search his car, though, before that, and they didn't find anything unusual. So, he was let go. A few months later, the owner of that property, where the car broke down, well, they found some mysterious ripped cloth in the area. And the FBI got a hold of that, and they realized that was the same material that was used in Polly Klaas's kidnapping. When reviewing 911 calls that evening, that's when Richard Allen Davis came back into play. This is while the search for Polly is still ongoing. Local Petaluma celebrity Winona Ryder at one point got involved. She offered a $200,000 reward. That led to nothing. In Polly's bedroom, they did find a palm print that matched no one else in the house. That palm print finally matched someone. Richard Allen Davis. So he was interrogated, and then he confessed to the kidnapping and murder of Polly Klaas. He then brought them to the site of Polly's body, which was severely decomposed because it had been there for months. So Davis went on trial, and he was found guilty, and he was sentenced to death. This was his reaction to the jury after that. Nice. He is still awaiting his execution. Hello, true crimerers. This is the case of Miranda Fenner. Viewer discretion is advised. And today's story takes us to the little town of Laurel, Montana. I've been getting requests to do a lot more like small town murders, so here we go. Miranda Fenner was born on December 26, 1979, and she was actually born in Sacramento, California. But then obviously sometime down the road, her family would relocate to Montana. When Miranda was 18 years old, she would work at a movie rental place called The Movie Store. They would rent out VHS. This is, to you young folks, this is how we used to watch movies. Think of it like an iPhone, but like the size of a cinder block. And you couldn't go back and watch it too many times or else it would like ruin the quality. Miranda was working a shift here on November 15th, 1998, just like any other shift she's ever done there. Around 8:15 p.m. that night, a passerby noticed a young woman crawling out of the store. So the Good Samaritan called 911, and when they got there, they noticed Miranda was on the ground and she was stabbed many, many times. She had stab marks in her head, in her throat. She had a slash across her throat. Somehow she had the energy to still crawl out of the store after her attacker fled. But sadly, about 2 hours later in the nearby hospital, she would succumb to her wounds and she died. And the lack of leads or evidence, it was staggering. They had nothing. There was no witnesses. This is before that CCTV footage was really a significant thing. They didn't have any DNA or hair samples, anything like that. They couldn't even piece together a motive because the till had been robbed, but it was like a very small amount of cash. Now, robbery could have been a motive and then it just sort of got out of hand, but they didn't know. The case went cold pretty quickly. There would be false confessions over the years, but none of those could ever be verified. Miranda's mom fought every single day to find justice for her daughter. They offered rewards, but again, nothing. And then, in 2019, the Billings Police Department made a surprise announcement. They finally caught the killer of Miranda Fenner. Why are they always terrifying to look at? This is a man named Zachary David O'Neill. In 2017, he walked into a Billings Sheriff's Department and confessed to the murder of Miranda Fenner. But given all the false confessions they've gotten over the years, they couldn't verify it. And Montana's a state where they actually can't use a confession and make an arrest. They need evidence. Until he confessed to the sexual assault and attempted murder of a newspaper carrier, which his DNA linked to that and was very similar to Miranda's case, he then got convicted. Hello, true crimerers. This is the case of the Lyon Sisters. Viewer discretion is advised. This was Catherine and Sheila Lyons, aged 10 and 12. They were living in Wheaton, Maryland. And on the early afternoon of March 25th, 1975, the Lyon Sisters went to the Wheaton Plaza Mall. They just wanted to walk around, look at some of the stores, just kind of have, a fun little lazy afternoon. So they left their home, according to their mother, around 11 a.m. that day. Their mother, named Mary, told them, "I need you home by 4 p.m. When 4 p.m. came along, the girls hadn't come home. 5 o'clock, 6 o'clock, nothing. By 7 o'clock, the parents called the police. Catherine and Sheila were missing. Police were quickly able to determine a pretty exact timeline of the girls' day. 11 a.m., they leave their home. Around 1 p.m., a neighborhood friend of the sisters says he saw the girls outside of the Orange Bowl speaking to a man that the child didn't recognize. Now, around 2 p.m., the Lyon sisters' brother, he would see them at the Orange Bowl as well, and they were eating pizza. Shortly before 3 p.m. that afternoon, the girls are seen walking down a street in the direction of their home. And after that, they were never seen again. This is their parents' worst nightmare. Their girls have up and vanished, and police have very, very few leads to work on. This is a composite sketch of a potential suspect. He was only ever known as the tape recorder man. You see, when the neighborhood friends saw the girls talking to a man, well, there were other children around them as well. A man fitting this description had a briefcase, and inside was a tape recorder. He was having kids talking to the microphone, leaving a message. What? Police were really going after this person. But another witness at the mall saw a person matching this description, staring very intently at the girls for a very long and very creepy amount of time. Police, for some reason, wouldn't really look at this guy as a viable suspect. A week after the girl's disappearance, a teenage boy named Lloyd Welch, pictured here, he would come forward saying he saw the girls being taken by the tape recorder man. Police had him take a polygraph test. He failed miserably. He then admitted he lied. He never saw the girls get taken. 39 years later, detectives working on the now cold case of the missing girls, they noticed a similarity between the mugshot and the composite drawing of the teenager looking at the girls. In the years since, Lloyd Welch had been convicted of child molestation. Red flag. Welch's cousin would come out and say he helped him burn 2 duffel bags around the time of the girl's disappearance. In 2017, Welch pled guilty to their murder. Hello, true crimers. This is the case of Alissa Turney. And this story takes us to Phoenix, Arizona. We're talking about my neck of the woods now. May 17th, 2001. It was the last school day of the year for Paradise Valley High School. And for Alissa, it was the end of her junior year. There was a big party planned that night, and Alissa was excited to go to it. Unfortunately, she never got to the party. Alissa's stepfather, Michael Turney, pictured here, the story he gave was that he picked up Alissa from school around 11 a.m. that day. They went to lunch, and then he says they got into an argument. They were discussing Alissa wanting more freedom to do what she wanted, in her life. When they got back to the house, he said that Alissa was still pretty mad, so she went to her room. Michael would leave the house around 1 p.m. He had to go pick up Alissa's sister, Sarah. Now, when Michael and Sarah returned to their home in Phoenix, Alissa was gone. And Michael claims there was a note that said that she had run off and she's going to move to California. Definitely seemed a little shady. So, police were called, but I guess they determined that no foul play was involved in this at the time. Which, to me seems a little strange. And the Turney family agreed that this was strange. This was not like Alissa. They don't think she ran away. Fast forward all the way to 2006. And at this time, by the way, there has been no contact with Alissa. No one has seen her since. We're talking a 5-year gap here. A man in Florida claimed that he murdered Alissa. But police were very quick to determine that nothing that man said added up. He would then say, maybe I was mistaken. Now in 2008, this is when police finally determined that foul play was involved. And a lot of this was determined because there were allegations that Michael Turney, her stepfather, was sexually abusing her. So they executed search warrants on Michael Turney's house. They found videotapes, surveillance videotapes, because Michael had placed cameras around the house without anyone knowing. There were conveniently no tapes for the days she disappeared. They also found 19 rifles, 2 handmade silencers, a van filled with gasoline containers, and 26 homemade explosive devices. It was the largest stockpile of explosive devices ever found in Phoenix. Her sister Sarah started a TikTok account and all of this led to Michael Turney finally being arrested and indicted for the kidnapping and murder of Alissa Turney. And this was just in August of 2020. And from what I can tell, Michael is still awaiting trial. He was the last one to see her alive. I hope he goes away for a long time. The murder of a 9-year-old girl in Tennessee would take over 30 years to solve. Hello, true crimerers. This is the case of Marcia Trimble. Viewer discretion is advised. Marcia was a 9-year-old girl living in an affluent neighborhood near Nashville, Tennessee, specifically in the Green Hills neighborhood. This was an area that was not really known for really any kind of crime, so what would happen in 1975 came as an absolute shock to everyone. On the afternoon of February 25th, 1975, Marcia would leave her house to deliver Girl Scout cookies around the neighborhood. Her family would never see Marcia again. She never got to the house to deliver the cookies. She never got back to her own home. 9-year-old Marcia just vanished in a matter of minutes, honestly. Her family reported her missing right away, of course, but this is something, like I said earlier, that this part of Nashville just was not used to. Almost as if they just weren't prepared for this sort of thing. But they began searching all of the water nearby. They would drag the lakes to see if they could find any bodies. but they never pulled anyone out of the water. They did searches all throughout the area on foot, with many volunteers and many police officers looking, but they never found her anywhere along those lines either. 33 days later, on Easter Sunday, 1975, they found her. Her fully clothed body would be found in a garage next to a couple bags of fertilizer. And this was at a house that was just right down the road from where she lived. Like, if you look at this map, there's her house there. She was last seen right there in the middle, and then that's the house where her body would eventually be found. They concluded that she was sexually assaulted in some capacity, and there was male DNA left on her, and then her cause of death was she was strangled. They obviously questioned the people who lived at that house, but they were able to rule them out. Her body was likely left there just as a dump site. Police suspected a 15-year-old neighbor boy by the name of Jeffrey Womack. He reportedly was the last one to see her when he refused to buy any cookies off of Marcia. He was known to be a bit of a troublesome, kind of a shithead. However, he passed multiple polygraph tests. They had an undercover officer befriend him in hopes of getting a confession, but they never got one. But in 1980, they still arrested him and charged him with her murder. But because they had no physical evidence, they had to let him go. It wouldn't be until 33 years later when they got a hit off the DNA that was left on Marcia. It matched this man, Jerome Barrett, a man who was working in the neighborhood at the time of her killing. His DNA was on file because he had also murdered another woman, Sarah Desprez. For both murders, he got life plus 44 years. It would be fingernail scrapings that would solve a decades-old cold case. Hello, true crimerers. This is the case of Lucille Hultgren. Viewer discretion is advised. In 1988, Lucille had been living in Galt, California. Sadly, her husband had passed away of natural causes a year prior in 1987. They were originally from Ohio, but they had been living in California for about 25 years. Lucille was known as kind of like the neighborhood grandma. She was always baking cookies and giving them to everyone. She was helping the kids in the neighborhood with like arts and crafts. She was really just trying to find a way to, enjoy her life since the passing of her husband. She was also a devout religious woman, and she would never, ever miss church. On May 23rd, 1988, her church friends would actually end up going to her house, which is located on Poplar Street and Oak Avenue. This is because Lucille had not shown up to church, and she had literally never done that before. Her friends were extremely worried for her. When they got to Lucille's house, they had noticed that a side door was kind of cracked open, so they walked in that way. That is when they discovered the body of 79-year-old Lucille Hultgren. So police would arrive very shortly afterwards, and it appeared that Lucille had been sexually assaulted. She had also looked to be beaten, and she was very clearly stabbed. The coroner would determine that she had been dead for likely 2 to 5 days. The last time anyone saw her alive was by her own 2 sons on Mother's Day. Now, police canvassed the neighborhood. They questioned everyone in Lucille's life, including her 2 sons. They even questioned people from her church, but they were never able to develop any suspects. The coroner would do the routine thing, and they clipped her fingernails and scraped underneath them to collect whatever DNA they could find. But again, this is in 1988, so they did not have the technology to just plug it into a system and find someone. But police were just at an absolute loss. More than 30 years would go by, and finally, her killer would be known. The DNA found under the fingernail scrapings, it would match 65-year-old Terry Bramble. In 1992, he had committed a sexual assault, and therefore his DNA was on record. But again, it wouldn't be until technology was further updated when they were able to get an actual match. This is a younger image of him, but he wasn't known to Lucille. He was sort of an on-again, off-again transient. Unfortunately, he will not get to face a jury or a judge. In 2011, he died of natural causes while living under a bridge. These are the ones that make me the most sad, because he got away with murdering this lovely woman. 17 years after a crime took place, skin cell DNA left behind on this hat would solve a murder. Hello, true crimerers. This is the case of Gretchen Burford. Viewer discretion is advised. Gretchen was born on June 6, 1938 in Seattle, Washington, but eventually she would move to Palo Alto, California. She did have 3 children, but after all 3 of them had grown into adults, she wanted to, start her own new life. So she became a lawyer. In 1984, when she was about 41 years old, she enrolled in law school and she would graduate. Eventually, she opened up her own practice, and this one was geared towards helping juveniles. She was very successful, she loved what she did, and no one could say a mean thing about her. On the evening of February 26, 1988, she would leave her office and then had a quick errand to run. Gretchen would pull up to a drive-through ATM for her bank, and she deposited a check for $449 at approximately 6:37 p.m. Police believe that it was at that time in the middle of that transaction when an unknown man entered her unlocked vehicle. He was armed with at least a knife, and he must have put it up to her. He would then force her to drive to another ATM in the area to withdraw whatever amount of money he requested. Gretchen had pulled up to the ATM at approximately 7:02 p.m. She entered in all her information and she tried to withdraw a certain amount of money, but the ATM said, "You don't have enough funds." Police believe she did that on purpose in order to convince her attacker that she didn't have the money he wanted. It's at that time when another vehicle pulls up behind hers at the ATM. There are 2 witnesses inside who saw the driver's side door of Gretchen's vehicle swing open, and they saw her try to leave, but then she was pulled back in by someone. Then she stepped on the gas and she purposefully crashed into a parked vehicle. She was then able to exit the vehicle, but as she was doing this, she was screaming, he stabbed me," and then she collapsed. The assailant would then run away. The witnesses came up with this composite drawing of her assailant, but the man was not caught. His face was plastered all over the news in hopes that someone would know who he was, but no one ever came forward. In the back of Gretchen's vehicle was this hat, believed to be left behind by the assailant. Gretchen, by the way, passed away later that night in the hospital. It would take 17 years later to pull DNA off of this hat, and it matched a man by the name of Tyrone Hamill, who was already in prison for life, but he was still convicted for Gretchen's murder. A man would go missing, vanished in the vast Arizona desert, but would he ever be found? Hello, true crimerers. This is the case of Sid Cranston Jr. Viewer discretion is advised. 40-year-old Sid was actually born and raised and lived a large portion of his life in New York, but he would eventually move to Kingman, Arizona. Kingman is a relatively small city in Arizona that runs along Route 66. Sid worked in the real estate industry. He would purchase some fixer-upper homes and turn a profit. He actually owned quite a few properties at the time of this case. Life was going really well for him. He was happily engaged. He had good friends. This was Al Blanco, a maintenance man who partnered with Sid to work on the properties. On June 15th, 2015, Al Blanco would actually meet Sid here at this In-N-Out in Kingman. It was just like a casual business meeting. After that, Al said Sid left and he had other appointments to go to, but Sid never made it to any of those appointments. Sid never got back to his home. Sid never answered any phone calls, which immediately began to worry his family. The next morning, Al Blanco would discover Sid's motorcycle at one of Al's properties. And then that was an immediate red flag to Sid's family. They knew something was wrong. They reported him missing. Now, Sid's brother Chris said that a couple of days prior to this disappearance, Sid talked to him and said that at one of their properties, something appeared to have been stolen. The house appeared to have been broken into. So Sid said he was going to basically do a stakeout there, which Chris thought was a little like, you shouldn't do that. So he thought the disappearance may have been related to that. When police went to check out the home, nothing seemed out of sorts. There was no signs of forced entry. Everything seemed fine. Sid wasn't there. The case would go cold, but then in 2017, a huge breakthrough. A pawn shop owner noticed that in some of Sid's missing posters, he was wearing some rings. Rings that the pawn shop owner was like, wait a minute, I have those. So when police got involved, they found out who pawned the rings. Oh God. It was none other than Al Blanco. A man by the name of Jeff Cave, who was also friends with Al Blanco, called police. He tried to extort $140,000 out of the family, saying he knows where the body is. When police arrive, he gets antsy, he gets crazy, he has a gun in his hand, and he ends up getting shot dead. So whatever he knew died with him. But then, police finally got a hold of Al's cell phone records, as well as Sid's. Turns out their cell phones were right next to each other the entire day that Sid disappeared. That is when a friend of Al Blanco's came forward. His name was Bill Sanders. He said, "I know where the body is, I will show you." Mr. Sanders would end up taking police to a property that was not related to Sid or Al, and they had to use backhoes to dig up a lot of dirt, and buried very deep beneath the surface was the body of Sid Cranston Jr. He had been shot once through the head. Al Blanco would be arrested and charged with the murder. They believed it was a financially related motive, something to do with stealing a lot of rent money from Sid, but he always, to this very day, maintained his innocence, saying that he had nothing to do with the murder. But that wouldn't matter in the end, because a jury would convict him, and he was sentenced to life in prison without parole. It would take 35 years for science to finally catch up and catch a killer. Hello, true crimeers. This is the case of Roger Dean. Viewer discretion is advised. 51-year-old Roger Dean lived in Littleton, Colorado with his wife, DJ. Roger was the co-owner of a local food brokerage firm. I'm not 100% sure what that is, but that's what he did. Sometime around 7 a.m. on November 21st, 1985, Doris would hear Roger calling for her from another room. When she walked out of the room she was in, she came face to face with a man wearing a ski mask and had a gun to her face. This is a recreation from Unsolved Mysteries. The intruder forced Roger to tie DJ up to a chair, and then Roger and the intruder go to a different room where DJ can hear them talking, but she couldn't make out exactly what they were saying. At some point, Roger tells the intruder that, "I have $30,000 I could give you." He told him, "It's in the bank, we can go get it." Now, Roger, whose hands were tied, allegedly, as they're approaching the front door, he decides to bolt. And that is when the intruder fires the gun and shoots him several times in the back. Roger would fall dead on the driveway, and the intruder would take off. When paramedics arrived, Roger was pronounced dead at the scene. There are a couple of weird things about the investigation. The first thing was the twine that was used to bind him, well, it only left indents on one wrist and fibers on one wrist. The other wrist showed no signs of being tied at all, meaning the entire time he was free to move his arms. The other concern is that roughly a month or so prior to this, Roger had taken $30,000 from his company, he embezzled it, and deposited it into his own personal account without his wife knowing. Then a couple of people in the neighborhood came forward to say they saw Roger in his garage around 7 o'clock in the morning, which to them is very unusual because if he was going to work, he would have left at around 6:15. Some said it looked almost as if he was waiting there for someone. This led to the speculation that perhaps Roger set up this entire thing. So then speculation came about that maybe Roger set up this whole thing, but why? 5 years later, in 1990, his wife DJ gets a threatening letter. The letter stated that she owed them $100,000. This person allegedly was the killer of her husband. The extortionist said to her, "We'll kill your daughter if you don't give me the money." This would lead to a phone call from the extortionist. And they even dropped off the money, but the money was never picked up by anyone. And then the case went cold for 35 years. DNA left behind on the killer's hat that he dropped would be tested 35 years later, and it matched a stranger. Michael Jefferson, a known criminal from Colorado. No connection to the family. He is still awaiting trial. This murdered cop case was cold for 31 years, and it would turn out that the assailant was someone much, much closer than they thought. Hello, true crimeers. This is the case of Lieutenant Joe Clark. Viewer discretion is advised. Joe lived with his wife in Marietta, Ohio, and by 1981 he had been a sheriff's deputy for about 14 years, specifically for Washington County's Sheriff's Department. It was a freezing cold, snowy February 7th, 1981 evening when Joe was having a relaxing night in with his wife watching a basketball game. During halftime, Joe got up and he went to the kitchen and he asked his wife if she wanted any snacks. He had been out of the living room for about 30 seconds when all of a sudden, bang, what sounded like a small explosion and then broken glass. His wife ran to the kitchen and found him on the ground with a pool of blood behind him. Joe Clark had been shot with what appeared to be a shotgun through this window of his kitchen. They found shotgun pellets in the house. They also found shoe impressions by a tree just outside this window. Deputy Clark was dead. That same night, by possible coincidence, a drug dealer was also killed. Now, it's relevant because he had just started a drug bust. There were rumors that maybe this drug dealer who was caught was an informant for Joe, but it would turn out through investigation that the two of these murders had no connection at all. Roughly 10 people in the neighborhood said they saw a very suspicious blue Pinto just sort of parked on the road in the neighborhood. A lot of people was, but they did not get a good enough look at him to describe them. And unfortunately, this case, it just went cold. 31 years later, they established a cold case group, and this was one of the very first cases they would look into. They determined that he was shot by a weapon commonly used by military or by cops. The boot impressions they found were military-style boots, some that are also worn by cops. Doing a lot more digging, they finally found out the truth. This was Michael Rubel. He had been working for the Sheriff's Department in 1981 when he was fired after being investigated by Joe Clark. He had beaten the living shit out of a arrestee/witness, and he totally broke protocol. Well, apparently he got very pissed at Joe Clark. So he had a friend drive him to the neighborhood in the blue Pinto, and he got his military shotgun, waited for Joe to go into his kitchen, and shot him dead. All for revenge. Damn near got away with it. He got life in prison, where he died in 2017. It would take a year to identify her, and 19 years to put the man who killed her away. Hello, true crimerers. This is the case of Amber Creek. Viewer discretion is advised. February 9th, 1997 was a freezing cold morning in Burlington, Wisconsin. Two hunters were out and about when they noticed the frozen body of a young woman here in this spot. It was on a nature preserve, and it looked like this was a dump site and not the murder site. The young woman was found with a plastic grocery bag over her head and tied tightly around. When the coroner got to her, it was determined that that is what killed her. She died of asphyxiation. She had also been severely beaten, she had bruises all over her body. And there were pretty obvious signs that she was also sexually assaulted, and that the sexual assault was very likely the motive of this crime. She also had a large cut across her face, and she had a pretty substantial bite mark on her body. And she was partially clothed. Now, police could not identify this young woman at first, so they thought she must have been some sort of runaway, possibly a homeless girl. It would be about a year later when her case aired on America's Most Wanted, when her father called in and said, "Oh my God, that's my daughter." Her name was Amber Creek, and she was just 14 years old. Amber had a very rough childhood. She was sexually assaulted many times. She developed severe depression, anxiety, and behavioral issues, so she ran away all the time. Eventually, she would become a ward of the state and was placed in a juvenile center. But on January 23rd, 1997, she left that juvenile center and was never seen by them again. In February of 1997, she was last seen alive by a group of people when they were all having a big party. She was last seen leaving the party with a man who looked like this based on descriptions that partygoers gave. Now, on the plastic bag that was around her head, they did find a full fingerprint, but at the time, it matched no one. They also had traces of male DNA that again matched no one at the time. In 2016, they finally got a match. The DNA and the fingerprints belonged to this man, James Eaton. He would have been about 19 years old at the time of the murder. He would end up pleading guilty to first-degree reckless homicide in 2016, and he got 40 years in prison. He can be paroled after 10. This is a case where, unfortunately, justice will never be served. Hello, true crimeers. This is the case of Nicholle Coppler. Viewer discretion is advised. By 1999, Nicholle was a 14-year-old girl living in Lima, Ohio, with her mother. Now, I'm a little unsure of this next part, but on May 19th, 1999, she would leave her home on her own accord, is what the stories say. It sounds to me like she was leaving her home on a permanent basis, and everyone knew, but I can't really confirm that for sure. It would later be revealed that her mother found out that she was hanging around a much older man. His name was Glenn Fryer. This guy was a bad dude. He had previous arrests for sexually assaulting minors and just like other smaller petty crimes. Now, after Nicholle left, no one really ever saw her again. And once they couldn't get a hold of her or find her, they obviously would report her missing. Now, 3 years would go by after her disappearance when Mr. Glenn Fryer was arrested for something else. This was a charge of sexually assaulting a 12-year-old girl. So police would then search the home where he was living, and in the house, they found Nicholle Coppler's ID card. They also found her diary, which apparently she was still writing in. There was an entry for 5 days after she was last seen by her parents. So on May 24th, 1999, there was an entry. It said that she had run away from home and she was staying with new people, but she wants to leave, but they're not letting her leave. So now with Fryer in jail under different charges, they're now going to investigate him for the possible murder of Nicholle Coppler, because she hasn't been found. But shortly after he was arrested for the 12-year-old's case, and right around the time that he was finding out he was going to be charged with possibly murder, he hung himself in his jail cell and he died. Police would search his home again after his death, but they did not find any other sign of Nicholle. Then fast forward to 2012, the home is demolished. And underneath the home, they found human remains. And it would later be confirmed to be those belonging to 14-year-old Nicholle Coppler. Police believe that Fryer was trying to get Nicholle into sex trafficking, but she refused. So he killed her for it. But he took the coward's way out, and now he is dead. So her and her family will never get justice. A thrown-away coffee cup would help solve a 47-year-old cold case. Hello, true crimeers. This is the case of Lindy Sue Biechler. Viewer discretion is advised. Lindy Sue was a 19-year-old newlywed who was living in Lancaster, Pennsylvania. Unfortunately, I really can't find any information on who Lindy was, as a person, but she seemed like a lovely young woman. On December 5th, 1975, Lindy's aunt would go to her apartments, which was the Spring Manor Apartments. Her aunt was going there because they had agreed to exchange some recipes that day. When the aunt opened the door because it was unlocked and walked in, a nightmare. She found the mutilated body of her 19-year-old niece. Lindy had been stabbed 19 times. Now, from what I understand, police collected blood from the crime scene and just stored it. Now, back in 1975, obviously they couldn't do anything with it. The technology didn't even exist. But thankfully, they kept it. They also found a footprint in blood in the apartment, and they believed it belonged to a male. So the very first person they questioned, obviously, because this is where you always go, is the husband. but they were very quickly able to rule him out as many witnesses were able to place him at his work during this murder. There was a witness who said that between 7 a.m. and 8:40 a.m. they saw a vehicle double parked just outside of their apartment. The police interviewed hundreds of suspects and witnesses, but they were never able to come up with anything. You know, they had like, oh, maybe the serial killer did it, but they ruled that serial killer out. Well, maybe this known sexual assaulter, well, let's investigate him. They ruled him out. They had no idea who killed this young woman. Fast forward to 2019. The DNA genealogy technology is now here, so they plugged the DNA they found at the crime scene into this, and luckily there was a profile outside of Lindy's, and it belonged to a man. This is what he would have possibly looked like back then, and this is what he would have looked like now. They released the image to the public, and they got tips. People would say that looked a lot like 68-year-old David Sinopoli. So, police began to investigate him. He was living in the exact same apartment complex during the time of the murder. No, he was never even looked at as a suspect or even questioned. So they had to kind of follow him around. They wanted to get his DNA sneakily. One day he was at the airport and he was drinking a coffee cup. He threw it out. Police very quickly grabbed it and they pulled DNA from that coffee cup, and it was a match. On July 18th, 2022, he was arrested and charged with the murder of Lindy Sue Biechler, and he is still awaiting trial.